Hi, my name's Lucas. I've been growing tomatoes for over a decade, and in today's video, I want to give you my top 10 tips for growing amazing tomatoes in your vegetable garden. Let's get started. Tip number one is something that all tomato growing pros know, and that is that you should always bury your tomato plants deeper. Strip off the bottom 2/3 of the leaves on your plant, pop it into the ground, and bury the stem. What this is going to do is it's going to create peripheral roots along that stem underneath the ground. So you'll not only have that original root ball, but you'll also have roots coming off of the stem. And this is going to create a larger root system, and bigger roots equals more fruits. See, I'm harassing my tomato just to prove a point. Tip two is always prune your tomato plants. Just kidding. Don't let anybody tell you have to trim your bushes. It's really just a matter of personal preference. In fact, I believe that the method of pruning you choose to use depends on the support structure you're employing. So in this case, I've got a nice, sturdy tomato cage that I built myself back in 2015, and this provides a full 360 degrees of support for these plants. I don't have to prune these plants at all, and I'm not going to. I didn't prune my tomatoes a few years ago, and they turned out just fine. I had some of the biggest tomatoes I've ever grown in my life, and they were extremely productive. Tip number three. If you don't want to spend a lot of money on the garden, I highly recommend going with a string trellis support method for your tomato plants. Let me show you how it's done. This dirt cheap trellis entails a simple frame made out of 1x1s and some string, obviously. This twine is really cheap. I got it for about $1 at my local dollar store. Tie a loop around the base, then pull the twine to the top of the structure and snip. Spiral the twine around the stem and tie it onto the top beam. If you have 2 stems, just add another string. Very, very simple. Tip number 4 for getting top tomato harvests is sunlight. Sun is incredibly important for tomato plants and other fruiting crops because they require so much energy. I'm not going to bore you with a big biology lesson here, but how it basically works is the sun's energy is converted by the leaves into sugars, which the plant uses to grow. Cherry tomatoes are actually a little more forgiving when it comes to not receiving enough sun. Beefsteaks, you really want to pump out the rays, but I recommend at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day, so pick the sunniest spot in your garden for your tomatoes if you're looking for that top production. A lot of people ask me why I grow vegetables in the front yard. I mean, it's pretty crazy. You don't see that too often. The reason is because of sunlight. There's a lot more sun in the front yard than the backyard, and so it's really a wise choice if you're looking to really maximize that production to choose the best area in your yard, even if it's the front yard. Of course, if your neighbors start hating on you, you can always just throw tomatoes at them. The truth is, I've got nothing but compliments from people passing by the front yard and seeing my vegetable garden. And I've met a lot of cool people and had a lot of cool conversations because of it. So, if you're thinking about being more neighborly, front yard garden might be just the way to do it. For tip number 5, we're gonna get dirty. But hey, don't go reporting this video just yet, because this one's all about soil. Growing great tomatoes always starts with the soil. It is the lifeblood of your tomato garden, and you need to make sure that you craft a great mixture in order to get the results you're looking for. But with so many different ingredients to add, and all these different videos and blogs about what to add to your soil, it can get pretty confusing. You'll find recommendations for all sorts of different soil amendments, from basic ones like composted cow manure, to sphagnum peat moss, to the more interesting ones like unicorn manure and composted shrooms, cut up fish heads. It gets pretty weird, but in reality, it really doesn't have to be that complicated. What I do is I go to my local big box store, pick up a few bags of compost, different types, mix them into the soil in the spring, and there you go. That's all there is to it. You can see that this dirt's pretty wet right now, but it's still a good tilth. It crumbles in my hand, it doesn't clump together, and it looks like good stuff. It's dark. This is gonna produce some good tomatoes, hopefully. Just because your soil looks nice and rich doesn't mean it actually is. Of course, you can't see the nutrients in your soil, and that's why it's so important to adopt a sound fertilizing routine, which is what I'm gonna talk about next. Despite its obvious importance for getting good production, I found that fertilizing is something that most gardeners get wrong, but they don't have to. See, it all really comes down to the 3 main nutrients plants need to grow, and that is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, I don't mean to nerd out on you guys and get into a full-blown chemistry lesson here, but basically how it works is nitrogen is good for leaves, phosphorus for root and flower development, and potassium is kind of an all-around boost for the plant and helps the plant develop as it grows. So, how does this periodic table trivia help me grow tomatoes? Well, you see, it's actually not that trivial. And the reason is that all fertilizer containers that you purchase should contain 3 numbers on them. This represents the ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or the NPK ratio of that particular fertilizer. Early on in the season, after I plant my tomatoes, I start applying a fertilizer that's high in phosphorus. Phosphorus, like I mentioned before, is the nutrient that's great for root and flower development. So many people make the mistake of putting on too much nitrogen. See, with an excess of nitrogen, you're gonna get a big, bushy, lush plant, and it's gonna look really healthy. People are gonna compliment you on your plant and say, wow, that is the most healthy, biggest tomato plant I have ever seen in my life. The problem is, you're not gonna have any tomatoes. And if you do, there won't be many. So rather than pour on the nitrogen, you're gonna wanna pick a fertilizer that's higher in phosphorus, which is the middle number of the ratio. So something like a 5-15-5 or a 15-30-15, which is what I use, would work well. Then, once your tomato plants start setting fruit, you want to up the potassium. This could mean opting for a different fertilizer that has a little higher amount of potassium, like say a 5-10-10 or a 15-30-30. And this will still provide your plant with the nitrogen it needs to grow, but with a more heavy focus on flowering and fruiting. Just be careful, because even though a box might have some veggies on it, doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right ratio. Always want to look at the numbers. The numbers don't lie. Tip number 7 for getting top tomato harvests is choosing the right variety. This is probably one of the most important tips for getting great production, because the genetics of the seeds you choose are really what's going to determine how productive your garden actually is. It's a big factor, so make sure you get it right. So you've got all your different categories of tomatoes, like your beefsteaks, your Romas, your cherry tomatoes, but then you can go deeper into the subcategories or varieties. Now, this year I'm growing mostly beefsteaks, but the varieties I'm growing are Big Beef, Better Boy, Early Girl, and there's one heirloom that I actually forget the name. So, hybrids versus heirlooms, what's the difference? Well, heirlooms are the more funky shaped ones. They've got really cool shapes, colors, amazing flavor, and these are the ones that have been passed down from generation to generation. And the hybrids are ones that are bred to be a certain productivity or flavor or color, and they are very productive and reliable versus the heirlooms. The heirlooms production can be pretty spotty, and that's why I always suggest that gardeners go with a majority of hybrid varieties in their garden portfolio to decrease the chance of diseases and pest problems, maximize production, and ultimately just have a tougher and happier vegetable garden. Tip number 8 is to use a drip irrigation system. Now, when I first started gardening, I was watering everything by hand with a watering can or a hose, and I think a lot of gardeners do this. But having an automated drip irrigation setup with a timer is going to save you hours and hours of labor throughout your seasons of gardening. It's something I highly, highly recommend for everyone, because it's really actually very simple to install this system. In fact, the one I have in my garden this year, I installed it in about 2.5 hours, and it's pretty inexpensive too. I think I only spent about $100 Canadian for all the supplies necessary. So don't be daunted by the irrigation systems. They really are simple, plug and play. If you can put Lego together, you can do this. Aside from the obvious labor saving benefits of the system, you're also going to have a lot more consistent watering with your tomato plants. And this is so important with tomatoes, especially as you get into the fruiting stage, because if water is inconsistent, what could happen is the fruits actually grow so fast, they grow faster than the skin expands, which causes them to crack. So if you want to avoid cracking of your tomatoes and have some really nice, solid fruits, go with the system. You will not regret it. If it rains, like it has been this season, we've been having a really rainy July here in Ontario, I just shut off the system. And then once we get into kind of a dry spell, that's when I'll switch it back on, so I don't have to think about watering. It does it all by itself. Finally, having a watering system is going to help you save on watering costs, because the water is going directly to the plant roots where it's required. And also, it's going to prevent your tomato plant's leaves from getting wet. Wet leaves are a recipe for disaster in the tomato garden. You can see this leaf here is looking a little yellow, and I believe this is because we've just been having so much rain lately. This is why a greenhouse would be ideal for tomatoes, but unfortunately most people don't have the money or the space to be spending on that. So having the irrigation system is going to help you prevent having to water overhead with the sprinkler system, which is going to help keep diseases at bay. Tip number 9 is to deal with pests and disease problems early on. There's a saying I really like. It goes, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." It's very cliche, you've most likely heard it before, but it's so suiting to the garden because as soon as you get a disease or an insect pest, if you don't treat that right away, it can spread throughout your garden and really wreak havoc. As far as pests go, flea beetles are the only issue I really have in my tomato garden. You can see here, there's a bunch of holes in these bottom leaves, and that's because these beetles have just been feeding off of them. So this is what I use. It's an organic compound called diatomaceous earth. It's a white powder, and what I do is I simply squeeze the bottle and lightly dust the bottom leaves that I see are having issues with flea beetles, and also around the base. What this is going to do is it's basically going to dry out the beetles and prevent them from attacking. This is just something I do early on in the season. Once the plants get about 2 to 3 feet tall, even like they are right now, you don't really need to do this because at that point they're growing so fast, the beetles can't keep up and they really won't be an issue for you. Of course, the lower leaves don't look the best when they have the holes in them, but ultimately it's not going to affect your harvest much, if at all. You'll see a lot of sources online that say to prune the lower leaves off of your tomato plants because these are the ones that are closest to the soil, most likely to get soil splash and therefore disease. Personally, I don't really bother unless they're looking really ratty or they look like they're getting diseased. At that point, you might want to think about plucking them off. Also, as you get later on into the season, you're going to start seeing something on the leaves called blight. This is bad news. There's really not much you can do to stop it once it happens, but it's really inevitable, and it usually happens with my tomato plants around harvest time, so therefore it's not much of an issue. But what I suggest in that case is to pluck off or snip off all the leaves that have blight on them and then dispose of them. Don't put them in the compost pile because they could spread those disease spores in the future and affect your future plantings. So discard them in the garbage, or if you have a bonfire, maybe burn them. But sanitation is so critical in the garden. Having clean hands, making sure you disinfect your tools with something like rubbing alcohol is really going to help you prevent spread of disease throughout your garden. All right, you've made it to tip number 10, the final tip of this video, and that is to maintain your garden and have fun with it. Gardening should not be stressful. It should be enjoyable, it should be relaxing. I find it very therapeutic to get out in the garden, in nature, hear the birds chirping around me, have that nice fresh air, and just be working in the soil, in nature, among the plants. For me, garden maintenance is pretty simple. It just involves tying up my tomato plants, pruning off any unwanted suckers, weeding, fertilizing, and occasionally enjoying a nice cold beer out in the garden. And at the end of the day, just be patient with yourself and your garden. You will fail at some point growing tomatoes. I've failed so many times in so many different ways. I've also had a lot of successes, and I think you will too if you follow these tips that I've given you in this video. I hope you get out there and grow some amazing tomatoes. If you're interested in putting in an effort, I think you're going to be happy with how your tomato garden does. I believe in you. All the best. My name's Lucas. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe because it really helps my channel grow, and I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers. Thank you for watching. Any questions? Leave them down below in the comments section. I will respond to you. I'm pretty good with that. And I hope you have a great day. Grow it best.